this opportunity to observe Tisha B'Av together. I'm joined, and my apologies, my screen is over here that tells me the information I need, but I am joined by rather incredible colleagues. Rabbi Estelle Mills, who's at Congregation Beth Jacob in Plymouth, Massachusetts. Rabbi Cantor Raina Siroty, who is at Congregation Gemiluth Chassodim in Alexandria, Louisiana. Rabbi Robert Haas in Mickve, Israel in Savannah, Georgia. Rabbi Jeff Goldwasser at Temple Sinai in Cranston, Rhode Island. Rabbi Emily Losben Ostrov at Temple Israel of Wilmington, North Carolina. And Rabbi Leah Berkowitz at Congregation Kol Ami in Elkins Park, Pennsylvania. It is truly amazing. These kinds of collaborations have been going on through the course of the pandemic. I've participated in everything from Yom Kippur afternoon to Tikkun Leil Shavuot, studies on the Megillah during Purim, and here we are gathering for Tisha B'Av, this day of mourning, of loss. So much of our history happened on this day of tragedy. And so just a few ground rules. We're on Zoom, and we're spread out, and I'm sure there are even more folks who are coming in. You will see in the chat that there are introductions where people are just telling us where they're from, because we are truly from far and wide. We are all over the United States. There are parents in LA, it looked like. Last year, we even had somebody from New Zealand that joined us. We are going to ask, as we get into the presentations, to try to make sure you are muted, and it's also helpful if your camera is off, because if your camera is on and different things pop up, then it can get kind of confusing in the Zoom room. If you do have a question, you can certainly use the chat. There might be some places of discussion in some of the different presentations, but also realize this is Tisha B'Av. This is a day of mourning and loss, of tragedy, and so it is going to be more somber, it is going to be more reflective. And so it is wonderful that we are all together, and I am going to shift the spotlight to my colleague, Rabbi Estelle Mills. Estelle, are you going first, and then we'll do Havdalah, or are we going to start with Havdalah?
Whatever you want to do, either way. I'll do a prayer to start, and then we'll before we begin. I'm just going to share my screen, and why we're a little bit about Tisha B'Av today. So there's a legend that is told about Napoleon, who, while taking a walk through the streets of Paris with his advisors one Tisha B'Av, passed a small synagogue, and he heard wailing and crying coming from within. Puzzled by the commotion, Napoleon sent an aide inside to inquire as to what had happened. The aide returned after a few moments and told Napoleon that the temple of the Jews had been destroyed, and they were mourning over its loss. Napoleon was outraged. How can it be that I have no knowledge of this event? Where in the empire did this occur? When did this befall the Jews of that community, and who were the perpetrators? The aide responded, "Sir, the temple was lost in Jerusalem on this date more than 1,700 years ago." Napoleon stood in silence and shock for a moment, and then said, "A people who can mourn for Jerusalem so long will one day have it restored to them." And with that, we will go into Havdalah.
And before we begin our observance of Tisha B'Av, we offer this experience of Havdalah ending Shabbat.
Lie, 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 lie. Yada lie, 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 yada lie, 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 lie. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei peri hagafen borei peri Michael, would you like to explain about the Samim?
So first we say I lit the candle, and we say a blessing for Kiddush, for acknowledging the sweetness of Shabbat that we carry with us into the week. I hold in my hand a spice box. That would typically be the second of the brachot of Havdalah, of this way of separating Shabbat, our day of rest and reflection and renewal, from the 6 days of work. Except we're going into Tisha B'Av, this day of loss. And so on this night, we don't say the blessing of the spices. We don't acknowledge that pick-me-up that we need as we depart from Shabbat, because we are going into not our 6 days of work, our regular weekday, but instead we're going into this night of Tisha B'Av.
Lie, 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 ya lie, 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 ya lie, 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 ya lie, 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 lie. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam borei meorei ha'esh borei meorei ha'esh lai 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 la 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 Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamavdil ben kodesh lechol hamavdil ben kodesh lechol.
And as we continue this opportunity to gather for this night of Tisha B'Av, one of the minhagim, one of the customs of this night, one of the responsibilities we have are to offer the words of Eicha, to offer the words of Lamentations, words of Jeremiah that remind us of were offered in the wake of the destruction of the first temple. And so I am going to come off the spotlight and turn it over to Rabbi Siroty as we hear these words of Lamentations.
Eicha yashva vadai ayir rabatia ayata kilmana rabati bagoim sarati bedinot Ayetalamas Achotivke Alayva Vedimata Alecheya In Lamelachem Mikoveha Koreha Bageduva Ayula Leoyevim Gaileta Yehuda Meoni Umerov Avodah Yasheva הרודפיה השיגוה בין המצרים. דרכי ציון אבלות, מבלי בהם אוהד, כל שעריך שוממים, כהניה נאנחים. בתולותיך נוגות בהימרה. היו צריה לראש, אויביה שלו, כי אדוני הגה ארוך פשעיך, עולליך, והיו שבי לניצר. I did an extra verse.
And we welcome Rabbi Robert Haas from Mickve, Israel in Savannah, as he begins this process of reflecting on this time of Tisha B'Av.
Thank you for inviting me to join you. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit about Tisha B'Av and why does it really matter anymore. To start off, I started as a rabbi in Dallas, Texas, and I wanted to do a Tisha B'Av service my first year there. They said, sure. So I did a Tisha B'Av service, and it went mediocre. Had a few people there. At my next synagogue in Houston, I wanted to try the same thing to see how it go, and I was refused. No, we don't do that here. We are part of the Reform movement, so we don't do Tisha B'Av, which I thought was really interesting. And as I look through the history of the holiday, we see it's a pretty big deal. I mean, it's known as part of the 3 weeks, where we avoid celebrations from the time when the temple was almost destroyed and through all the way to Tisha B'Av, the 9th day. Some don't shave or cut their hair. We don't go to weddings. Some don't even listen to music during this time. Some people refrain from eating certain foods or drinking alcohol for the entire time. It's a full fast day. It's the only other full fast day besides Yom Kippur, although Yom Kippur is 25 plus hours. Tisha B'Av is only 24 hours. It's got special rules. It can't be on the Sabbath. It should be on the Sabbath this year, but it's not, because if it's on the Sabbath, you actually move it to the next day, which of course is Sunday, which starts tonight. It's a holiday that has a lot of history, a lot of meaning behind it. And so the fact that a synagogue or many synagogues will refuse to even have a Tisha B'Av ceremony of any kind is a little jarring. I mean, it's very similar in many ways to Yom Kippur. You don't wear leather, you don't wear perfume, some people, you don't do contracts, even though it's not a work off holiday. You may not study Torah because you're supposed to not do that. You wear a black ribbon, you sit on the floor and mourn, you read from Eicha, which is one of the most beautiful but most depressing of all the books in the Bible. And so why is this the case that there is so much support in some places, but so much, not hate, but ignorance, antithesis of love? There's a belief that we shouldn't do it at all. There's an idea that Tisha B'Av has had its day and the Reform movement just doesn't agree with it. And I can see why. It's very understandable. We commemorate the destruction of the 2 temples, obviously, especially the second one, where, of course, we would go into exile for 2,000 years. Also, all the other terrible things that have happened have kind of been put on this day. The beginning of the Crusades, the expulsion from Spain, the expulsion from England, World War I starting off. So all of these difficult times have put in here, but it really centers on not the Bar Kokhba revolt, not World War I, not the many misfortune. It centers on the temples, the destruction of the 2 temples, which in the Reform movement is not necessarily a tragedy at all. Now, it's a tragedy that people died. It's a tragedy that people were kicked out of their homes. But because of the destruction of the temple, the priestly class and their control of Judaism ended. Because of the destruction of the Second Temple, basically all sacrifice had been put into one place. And when the Second Temple was destroyed, the priests had no more power. And what happened? The other group of Jews that were vying with the priests to be the spiritual leaders, the proto-rabbis, took over, and instead of sacrifice, we had, of course, study, we have synagogue, we have prayer, all of these things that were used. In other words, many Reformed Jews and many Jews believe the end of the Second Temple, the destruction of the Second Temple, is why we have Judaism at all today. If we had kept that Second Temple and kept that whole sacrificing animals thing, then Judaism would have ended. So in other words, we shouldn't be upset about the destruction of the Second Temple, the death definitely, but not the end of it as all. As scholars have argued for generations, priests in those centuries had become a detached class of plutocrats, mostly urban, given to corruption, and disengaged from the needs of the populace on the countryside. In this atmosphere, the theory goes, a democratizing rabbinic class was born, as it were, and a most welcome replacement for the status-obsessed aristocracy of the Jewish priesthood. Not only were the priests in control of the temple, of the religion, but they had become quite corrupt through the ages, starting probably with the Maccabees. The Maccabees' descendants really corrupted it or took it over. And through the years, it was not a place that many people thought of as a religious house of worship. But what was really interesting to me is I found support for Tisha B'Av in the Reform movement from the most unlikeliest source of all time. Like the most unbelievable place where we find support for Tisha B'Av from the Reform perspective from a man named David Einhorn himself. David Einhorn is the great radical reformer of the 19th century. Isaac Merewise founded Reform Judaism, but it was David Einhorn who really created what Reform Judaism was going to become. They vied with each other for control. Einhorn wins, and that's the reason we have classical Reform Judaism in many respects. He was a man who was very much against the trappings of Judaism, against the priestly class, against all of these things, but yet he was very supportive of Tisha B'Av in the 19th century. I'll read some excerpts from a sermon he gave 150 years ago. Indeed, Judaism regards self-determination as the very life breath of piety. It relies on levers of obedience entirely different from that. Therefore, the more the word of God was strengthened in the hearts of Israel, the more in the course of centuries people followed the call of the prophets, and a destiny full of the most miraculous divine guidance, the more they were cleansed from all pagan customs. The more they opened their hearts to God, the more did the state aspect of the religious life and with the Jewish national life as a whole begin to decay. And when at last the love of God had gained full mastery of the holy temple, and with it the shackles of religious coercion melted away in its flames to let freedom emerge from the ashes as the triumphant queen and master, God's people went down into dust, and in their stead arose a religious congregation whose members were to endure scouring and death, not because of their faithfulness, as has been in the case until then, but on the contrary, because of their faithfulness to God. From now on, it was no longer the threatening sword of judgment, but rather the heart which was determined to create a relationship between God and human beings. From the ashes of one temple, thousands of places of worship came forth. In other words, he understands the idea that we must mourn those who died. But for him, this moment in time is a moment we cherish in many respects because it set the direction of Judaism. Instead of one place going from animal sacrifice, where one group of people controlled prayer and we prayed through them, the only place you really were supposed to worship was in Jerusalem, to having synagogues around the world, to having study, to having direct relations with God, to encouraging the study and the education of our people, to support the idea of the prophets, the idea that we're supposed to make the world a better place. This all happens because of this moment. In other words, he says, the Messiah was born in those very ruins. So, even though it's a tragedy for everyone in terms of those who died, Einhorn, as many of us, but he's the one who set the precedent, believe it was a moment in time which was essential for the continuation of our religion. We honor the memory of those who died, and we also honor the idea that out of tragedy, our ancestors, instead of letting the religion just die out as so many other thousands and thousands let happen, we said, no, this religion is beautiful. We just need to evolve. And that is exactly what they did. And that's what we do as Reformed Jews today. We evolve, believing that we have to create as we change while keeping connections to the past. So there are so many ways to think of Tisha B'Av. Some would say, well, we can think about the idea that we're supposed to be environmentally conscious. That's become a big part of it from Echa. But what I love about the fact is that this man, David Einhorn, who was so against the idea of the temple, was so against the idea of these regulations, that one group of people having control, he really believed we should honor the memory of those who died. We should honor the memory of the temple that served a very important purpose for a long time. And we should honor our ancestors who, in desperate times, when everything seemed to be ending, decided we're going to remain Jews. We're going to improve the religion. Reform recognizes in the flaming temple not a curtailment, but rather a continuation of the divine work of Sinai, which had begun on flaming Mount Sinai. Just as the temple was destroyed in flames, so Judaism was created in the flames at Mount Sinai. So I want to wish everyone all the best as we mourn and honor those who died, and remember that it's not tragedy that defines us, it's how we react to tragedy.
And we offer chapter 2 of Echa.
Echa Yair Be'apo Adonai Et Bat Zion Ishlich Mishamayim Eretz Tiferet Yisrael Velo Zachar Adom Raglav Beyom Apo Bila Adonai Velo Chama Et Kol Neot Yaakov Haras Be'avrato Mitzeret Yehuda Hegia La'aretz Chilel Mamecha V'sorecha Gada Bachor Yav Kol Keren Yisrael Eshiv Achor Kesh le'ovar achelav saviv.
And we welcome to our Bahal, Rabbi Elizabeth Bahar in Macon, Georgia. And there's Rabbi Bahar. And before Rabbi Bahar begins, at some point, Rabbi Siroty, would you, whether it's before the next chapter or the last one, give us just a little bit of insight into the cantillation and the chant of Eicha? Okay.
Absolutely.
So we welcome from Macon, Georgia, Rabbi Elizabeth Bahar.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about conflict and how it's an inevitable part of human existence, but I'm going to look at it through the lens of a very famous story that the rabbis crafted when contemplating and thinking about why was the temple destroyed. So after the temple was destroyed, the rabbis had to really come up with some sort of meaning for this extreme destruction and this absolute catastrophe that befell the entire Jewish world. And so one of the ways that they did was an explanation that the temple was destroyed because of senseless hatred, or sinat chinam. And the first of this story that we see is in the Talmud, in 1556a, and it goes like this. There was a certain wealthy Jew who lived in Jerusalem who had a friend named Kamsa and an enemy named Bar Kamsa. He sent his servant to invite Kamsa to the feast, and of course the servant invited the person who we don't want, Bar Kamsa, to the feast. And when Bar Kamsa shows up and he sits down at the meal, the host goes over to him and says, "What are you doing here? Get out!" And Bar Kamsa replies, "Since I am here, let me stay. I will please pay for whatever I eat and drink. Don't humiliate me, please. Don't put me to shame." And the host says, "No, get out." And Bar Kamsa says, "I'm willing to pay for half of the entire feast." And the host says, "No, get out. And I'm willing to pay for the whole feast," he says. And the host at this point is getting very agitated. We can imagine the entire scene happening. And he pretty much forces Bar Kamsa out. And Bar Kamsa replies, because everybody at the feast could see what's going on, including the rabbis in the community. Since the rabbis were sitting there and did not stop him, this shows that they agreed with him. I will go and inform against them, meaning against all of the rabbis who were at this feast, against the entire Jewish community, to the government, to the Roman authorities. In other words, because the host publicly insulted Bar Kamsa, while the rabbis sat and observed and did nothing, Bar Kamsa went to the Roman emperor and slandered the entire Jewish community. And the end result was a siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the Second Temple. The lesson of this tragic story can be summarized by the quote from Edmund Burke in the 18th century: "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." In a different teaching, though, when we think about, was it evil that was truly the precipitating force in causing the destruction of the Second Temple, I think Leviticus 19:17 offers a teaching or a clue when it says, "Lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha," you shall not hate your brother in your heart. And it's the Rambam, Maimonides, who goes on to explain that this verse specifically prohibits harboring hatred in silence, holding it within. Instead, he continues and guides us toward the end of the concluding statement in the verse of Leviticus: "You shall certainly rebuke your neighbor and not incur sin." Pent-up hatred, therefore, according to Maimonides, is forbidden, but a constructive use of the emotional power that it possesses is actually a command and a mitzvah. So if we were to think about the story, of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, really with the idea not of Sinat Chinam, but the idea of this is an opportunity where there should have been some rebuke. The rabbi should have been rebuked. The host should have been rebuked. We can see that it's the uselessness of hatred that can build up in conflict. And when that sits there, that can cause toxicity to build up within the community. But if it's actually the problem is addressed, we can see that toxicity has an opportunity to end and perhaps a new cycle begin. I think this story is illustrated beautifully in terms of the breaking of a cycle within a conversation that comes to play between Rabbi Meir and his wife Beria in Talmud Masechet Bracha 10a. In this case, Rabbi Meir is plagued by these ruffian neighbors who are just bothering him and irritating him to such an extreme that the rabbi prayed for their demise. He prayed for their death. And Beria, citing Psalm 104, redirects her husband instead not to pray for the death of these thugs, but rather that pray for them to end their sin so that the sinners would be no more. Not again their death, but that they would repent and themselves become upright. Beria helped Meir stop. Beria helped Meir reconsider all of his options and eventually helped chart a new course. He followed her advice. The neighbors changed their way, but only after Meir had changed the way he directed his own personal internal passions. So perhaps unexpectedly, again, we see that the Torah doesn't prevent us from having hatred. It doesn't say that there's not going to be conflict. In fact, it does say that there will be conflict, but it presents several parameters, saying that Sinat Chinam, the senseless hatred that's displayed in the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, the hatred for nothing that festers and can be destructive, that's prohibited. But if we channel that hatred for a good purpose, this can lead to a greater sense of self-understanding and a clear path for right and wrongs that we might encounter. The problem of Sinat Chinam, of the senseless hatred, is the aimlessness that it possesses. It's the problem that happens when you simply vent about a problem, when you gossip with friends as if you're actually addressing it, and continue to spread that toxicity within the community. But again, you don't address the actual problem. You don't break the cycle. You're just blowing feathers from a pillow out into the air. But like everything that comes to spirituality and deep spiritual practice, addressing the problem takes effort. It may sound easy, but I think we all know from experiences, confrontation, confronting ourselves and confronting other people is a huge challenge and very hard. It can be painful to find ourselves in difficult situations. And yet we have the capacity to choose to be reactive or to be reflective. We can respond with hatred and continuing discord, or we can engage differently. We can pray. We can take a breath. We can pause. We can see the good. I want to, again, play with the terms sinat chinam, senseless hatred. The idea of the chinam being from nothing. The word means from nothing or without value. Sinat, hate, okay? But if we look at the root of chinam, it comes from the word chen, which is often translated as grace, in the sense that it's freely given. We freely give love without any cost or responsibility to the recipient. But when we think about it in the sense of hatred, those who hate without constraint inflict costly injury and take no responsibility for their actions. In fact, they are the ones who leave a trail of tears and destruction behind them. So if we return with the idea of the deeper understanding of what senseless hatred is, that it is the possibility of hatred that can be destructive, toxic, and leave a trail of tears. that we have the capacity to break any cycle, as explained by Bruria and Meir, and that it is incumbent upon us when we find and experience a challenge, as taught by the Rambam, that we must actually rebuke the person and teach them. We can really see that why, we can really perhaps understand and see why it is that the rabbis believe that the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa was so powerful. The senseless hatred was allowed to just fester and grow to the point that Marcos allowed his emotions to grow out of control, and that his hatred spilled over into the destruction of everybody. We see that instead of rebuking the rabbis, or the rabbis rebuking themselves, their own inaction also led to tremendous violence and destruction against the community. So in essence, the idea of senseless hatred is that it's not intended, I believe, or the story, I think, is not intended to scare us, but intended to, I think, educate us, to encourage us to, when we see a problem, address it, not allow our hatred to fester and grow everywhere. And lastly, treat everybody with a little bit, if possible, kindness, compassion, and understanding. That your Tisha B'Av is meaningful. Thank you.
So before I chant the chapter 3 of Eicha, I just wanted to give a little bit of background on the Eicha trope. So it is its own trope melody group for itself. So we have 5 different melodies in which we chant Torah and Haftarah. And so we have Torah trope, we have Haftarah trope, we have trope for Shir HaShirim, and we have trope for Eicha, and we have trope for Esther. And all 5 trope groups are a little bit different. Eicha is supposed to sound a little bit more mournful than the rest. I really try for that to be the case. I still find that there is a lot of melody to the trope patterns that are the melodies that tell us based on the symbols that if you look at the Book of Lamentations, that you will see markings that don't look like the vowel markings that would be under the letters. And those are the markings that tell us how we are supposed to chant them. And it is indeed a very beautiful trope. And I hope that you enjoy hearing chapter 3, which I will be sharing my screen in just one second. Ani hagever Rani beshevet evrato oti nahar vayolach hoshech belor ach bi yashu yahafoch yado kol hayom bila vesari veori shibar atmotai ana alai ayakov roshullah במחשכים הושיבני כמיתי עולם.
That was beautiful, Rabbi Cantor Siroty. It's such a pleasure to hear you chant. I'm Rabbi Leah Berkowitz. I'm glad to be joining you today, and I'm joining you to talk about one of my favorite Hebrew words. And I learned this word, and it's kind of strange on a holiday, it's kind of mournful that this is where my favorite word comes from. But I had the privilege in rabbinical school of studying the Midrash on the Book of Lamentations with Rabbi Bernard Melman. And as one of my favorite classes that I took in seminary, again, ironically, because it's a very sad book. And the word that I learned to really love from studying this text is lihafoch, which is a verb that means to turn upside down. And we actually just heard it. That was perfectly timed, Rabbi Siroty. That one of the verses from chapter 3 that she chanted contained the verb lihafoch. And one of the reasons I like this word so much is because it is very versatile in its usage. So it can refer to a physical reversal. It can refer to a reversal of fortune, an external reversal, or the unsettled feeling of having one's insides and organs churning. So it's used in other places in the Tanakh to refer to a change of heart, which we might think of in terms of when Israel was in Egypt. And it is the root of the words hefech, which means contrary, mahapecha, which means overthrow or revolution, which we actually see in the book of Jonah, tachpulcha, which means perversity. And it is even used in modern Hebrew for latte, which is called café hafuch, that literally means upside down coffee because there's more milk than coffee in it. And recently, one of the most interesting usages of this was that people have started but adding to the phrase Yehi zichronam livracha, may their memory be a blessing. Yehi zichronam lemahapecha, may their memory be for a revolution. So this started as something that Israelis were doing in cases of domestic abuse or violence, but it was actually used pretty widely after the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. May her memory be for a revolution. So these are some usages of this. So it actually only appears a few times in, only feels a few times in the book of Lamentations, but the entire book and also the Midrash contained within Lamentations Rabbah is filled with images of reversal. So there are images, and you've probably already seen a few of them in what we heard chanted if you were looking at the translation. We have instances of allies becoming foes. A princess becomes a slave. A beautiful city becomes a desolate pile of ruins. At the beginning, we see, there are none to comfort her amongst her friends. That's something we would imagine that your circle of friends are the people who comfort you in a difficult time. That is reversed. It's not how it's supposed to be. Dancing becomes mourning. And most importantly, a God that once felt close and comforting now seems distant and punishing. So in some synagogues, these images are internalized and concretized by turning over the chairs in the sanctuary and sitting on the floor, so that we can feel what it's like to sit in a city that has been overthrown by the enemy. So I'm going to show you a few instances of this word. Just a second. Okay, so hopefully you can all see this. So we're going to see a few instances of the word, and if we were having a discussion, these are some of the questions I'd be asking that maybe you could be thinking about in your own spaces. So we're looking at the different ways that lehafoch can be understood in these contexts, not only the word, but also the imagery. And then thinking about experiences, which you probably had many of in the last few years, where it felt like things were being turned upside down. Where have we felt this lehafoch in our own lives? So first we have in chapter 1, we have this internal lehafoch, which is, see, O Eternal, the distress I am in. My heart is in anguish. Literally, my heart has turned over within me. Nehefach libi b'kirbi. I know how wrong I was to disobey. Outside, the sword deals death. Indoors, the plague. Next, we go to chapter 3, what we just read. I am the person who has known affliction. Under the rod of God's wrath, me, God drove on and on in unrelieved darkness. None but me, God brings down God's hand. So this is Yahafoch Yado. So this image of reversal is now being applied to God's hand is turning over and over and over again on us. So like a repeated beating. Again and again without cease. Now, when we see this word in chapters 4 and 5, we see it surrounded by these images of reversal that later get built upon in Lamentations Rabbah, which is a really interesting, if very dark and depressing book that ends on a hopeful note, as we will see. The precious children of Zion, once valued as gold, alas, they are counted as earthen pots, the work of a potter's hands. The tongue of the suckling cleaves to its palates for thirst. Little children beg for bread. None gives them a morsel. Those who feasted on dainties lie famished in the street. Those who are reared in purple have embraced refuse heaps. The guilt of my poor people exceeded the iniquity of Sodom, which was overthrown, hahafucha, in a moment, without a hand striking it. So here we see these reversals of the most vulnerable being the least cared for, and also the most wealthy, the most delicate, the most being the people who are usually in the best position being in the worst. And again, that's a lot built upon a lot in the Midrash. You see people who were used to being carried on a litter are now scrounging around in the mud for food. And one of the most difficult images of reversal that we see actually we see it in the book of Deuteronomy, but we also see it in Lamentations Rabbah, is, we think of the parent relationship to the child as, I will do anything to care for this child. And we have instances where the reverse has happened, where people are so desperate for survival that they prioritize their own survival over that of their children because they're that distressed. So in chapter 5, we have two instances, sort of bookends of this word. Remember, O Eternal, what has befallen us. Behold and see our disgrace. Our heritage has passed to aliens. Nehefcha. So in this case, it's indicating a transfer of basically the title of our inheritance is going to someone else. Our homes to strangers. So here we have a series of things where people are becoming something else. We have become orphans, fatherless. Our mothers are like widows. We must pay to drink our own water, obtain our kindling at a price. We are hotly pursued. Exhausted, we are given no rest. We hold out a hand to Egypt, to Assyria for our fill of bread. Our fathers sinned and are no more, and we must bear their guilt. Slaves are ruling over us, with none to rescue us from them. We get our bread at the peril of our lives, because of the sword of the wilderness. Our skin glows like an oven with the fever of famine. They have ravished women in Zion, maidens in the town of Judah. Princes have been hanged by them. No respect has been shown to elders. Young men must carry millstones, and youth stagger under loads of wood. Old men are gone from the gate, and young men from their music. Gone is the joy of our hearts. Our dancing is turned to mourning, which in Hebrew is nehefach le'evel mecholenu. So we have all of these images of going from the bottom to from the top of happiness to the top of society to the very bottom, and we have our dancing is turned to mourning, But we do want to end on a hopeful note. And even though this is the last time we see the word here, the word lehafoch here, we do have this request, and we have this of Hashivenu, which is probably something you are familiar with from High Holy Day liturgy. Take us back, O Eternal. Take us back, O Eternal, I'm sorry, I got a time warning, to yourself, and let us come back, renew our days as of old. So I'll wrap this up. So in both Lamentations and Lamentations Rabbah, we see that the moment the temple is destroyed, something else is reversed, and that is the sinful status of the Israelites. The Israelites go from, prior to Lamentations, they've been this community of sinners that needs to be punished, and here they become a community of individual victims and a communal victim that needs to be comforted. Confronted with the suffering of the Israelites laid out in incredible detail, God agrees to comfort the people and to promise them a return to their former glory. The destruction of the first and second temples resulted in a drastic change in how the rabbis looked at the universe, at divine justice, and at God. In Lamentations and Lamentations Rabbah, the rabbis wrestle with the problem of how to experience God in a world that is filled with human suffering. By doing so, they hope to once again reverse our status from a people that has been punished and neglected to a people that is comforted and exalted. In this way, we can go from being hafuch to being chadesh, as in chadesh yamenu kakedem, renewed after our destruction, and hashiv, returned to God's loving embrace. All right, thank you. I think we're going back to Rabbi Siroty.
I am trying to share my screen, so it's there. Echa yuam zah yishnei haketem hatov tishtapekna avnei kodesh berosh kol chutzot b'nei Tzion hekarim hamsulaim b'paz echa nechshevu lenivnei cheres masei yedei yotzeh gam tanim chaletzu shad einiku gureihen atami leachzar kenim bamidbar davach l'shon yonik echiko atzama olam lim shalu lechem poreis ein lahem.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rabbi Jeff Goldwasser from Temple Sinai in Cranston. And we're going to talk a little bit about fasting and the role of fasting in Tisha B'Av, and maybe even ask the question, should we be fasting today? I'm going to talk a little bit first, and then Rabbi Emily Losben Ostrov will pick it up after me. So Rabbi Haas, in the very first shiur we heard this evening, talked about how David Einhorn, pretty much the ideological founder of Reform Judaism, embraced Tisha B'Av, but also saw Tisha B'Av as something that was a symbol of, a positive symbol about how Judaism had transformed itself through the destruction of the temple and become something new. And what I want to suggest is that's actually not like a modern idea. That's not something that begins with David Einhorn in the 19th century. That's an idea that actually is already within the tradition from antiquity, from the Hebrew Bible itself. So to show you what I'm talking about here, I'm going to show you, this is a quote, if I can find it here in just a second, quote from Zechariah, prophet of the Hebrew Bible, who writes, "Thereupon the word of Adonai of hosts came to me. Say to all the people of the land and to the priests, when you fasted and lamented in the 5th and 7th months, all these 70 years, did you fast for my benefit? These are the things you are to do. Speak the truth to one another. Render true and perfect justice in your gates, and do not contrive evil against one another, and do not love perjury, because all those things that I hate, declared Adonai. And the word of Adonai of hosts came to me, saying, Thus said Adonai of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, which is the 17th of Tammuz, the fast of the 5th month, that's today, the 9th of Av, and the fast of the 7th month, the fast of Gedaliah, that comes right after Rosh Hashanah, and the fast of the 10th month, the 10th of Tevet, shall become occasions of joy and gladness. Happy festivals for the house of Judah, but you must love honesty and integrity." So what is the prophet saying here? What is Zechariah's intention? You know, he's saying that, look, fasting may make you feel good, but is it something you're doing for you? Or is it something that is something you're doing for me, for God? Or is it something that you're just doing for yourself to satisfy your own ego? I don't like that so much. I would rather that you not fast at all, and that you instead practice justice within your communities. That's a much better way for you to mark even Tisha B'Av as a day. Now that might sound familiar to you because it sounds a lot like another prophetic passage that we're very familiar with, and that's from the 2nd Isaiah. Has a quote that we read on as the Haftarah of Yom Kippur. So a lot of people are very familiar with this. I'm just going to put it up very quickly. Yeah, there we go. So in Isaiah 58, the prophet says, "Is such the fast I desire, a day for men to starve their bodies? Is it bowing the head like a bulrush and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call that a fast? A day when the Lord is favorable? No, this is the fast I desire, to unlock fetters of wickedness, to untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke." So 2nd Isaiah is picking up on the same theme as Zechariah here and saying, maybe fasting isn't such a great thing. Maybe it's more kind of something that you do for yourself, but you're not really doing for God. What God really wants you to do is to treat each other with justice, to create that world that in which the destruction of the temple no longer matters because we have brought about the kingdom of God into the world on our own. I'm going to turn it over now, and we'll have a conversation to see what we think we ought to be doing with Tisha B'Av, how we ought to be practicing it today. So I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Emily Losben Ostrov.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi Goldwasser. I'm actually going to invite you at this moment, if anybody wants to turn on their camera, you can, because I want to really have an opportunity for us to understand the holiday of Tisha B'Av, or the commemoration or observance, or careful in the words that we're using, and how it affects you and relates to you. As we heard from Rabbi Haas before and Rabbi Goldwasser, for many of you, I'm guessing if you've come from a Reform background, you probably haven't observed this day very often. And if you want to use the reactions or even just turn on your screen and lift your hand, I'm curious for how many of you this may very well, in fact, be the very first time you're observing Tisha B'Av. I see a few hands. Okay, seeing a few people raising their hands. For those of you, though, who maybe come from a more traditional Jewish background, you are used to all of the restrictions that we heard about in terms of this day being an opportunity to really sit in our sadness, is what I try to say, sit in our sadness. And this concept, just like with Yom Kippur, we refrain from eating and drinking, even water. We refrain from washing or bathing, shaving, wearing cosmetics, leather shoes, engaging in intimate relations. Work is allowed, but in a sense, it's also kind of discouraged. We're not, as we heard, even supposed to read Torah because that's something that brings us joy. And it's also an idea of mourning. In fact, I even read somewhere where we're supposed to refrain from smiling, refrain from laughter, refrain from idle conversations, and we are to sit on low stools or on the floor. I'm loving seeing things come in the chat and seeing your facial reactions to this. And so I go back to what Rabbi Goldwasser said, what Rabbi Haas said. Given all of that, do we still want to observe this day as a day of fasting, as a day of lamenting? And how can we maybe keep this day if we're not waiting as Reform Jews for the third temple to be rebuilt, to go back to a time of different classes and a time of priests, a time of sacrifices? What are we lamenting? And is it enough to just lament on the history?
Honey, please.
Well, we just heard Lori share with her animal. I'm guessing it's a cat, but I'm not sure. Clearly lamenting there. So I appreciate, Lori. That was perfect. Great timing. But I want to encourage you to keep putting in the chat your thoughts. And I'm curious if anybody feels that maybe, and this could be a little provoking, but maybe we shouldn't fast on this day. And just as a reminder for those who may be unclear, for many Jews, I think we know to fast on Yom Kippur, and we heard that about the other fast days, but just to make sure that everyone is on the same page, when it comes to the fasting, the only two full fast days, meaning from sundown to sundown, is Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av. And the other fast days, you fast actually from sun up to sundown. And so some of us may be familiar with those that Rabbi Goldwasser mentioned. I know for me personally, the minor fast day, as we call them, that actually resonates the most with me and is one that we didn't mention, is actually the fast of Esther. And we know that from the text. And for me, I tend to relate to that one. So I'm looking in the chat to see what your thoughts are, whether it's your thoughts on fasting or whether your thoughts on just observing the day in general. I'm reading, Rabbi Goldwasser, do you want to just jump in and share what you just said as well, or just a brief bit of that?
So, yeah, sure. So I do fast on Tisha B'Av, and I've done that for many years. But I break off my fast at Mincha, at the afternoon service. There's a traditional practice that afternoon of Tisha B'Av is the only day during the year where you put on tefillin for the afternoon service as a sign of rebirth and renewal and hope that the pain of loss will be transformed into hope for the future. So I think it's appropriate to break off the fast at that point if you daven Mincha tomorrow afternoon.
Thank you, Rabbi Goldwasser. It reminded me of, as well, with what Rabbi Berkowitz said in the quote of turning our mourning into dancing. There's a great Debbie Friedman song that I would ask Rabbi Siroty to sing, except we shouldn't maybe sing that yet today. But anyway, she'll sing it for us some other time, of how we can turn our mourning into dancing. And maybe actually that's part of how we see this observance. Do we see this as a time where we are solely mourning, or a time for us to take our mourning and move it into action? in the same way as we heard about Sinat Chinam, can we take this baseless hatred and instead move it into love, as we heard from Rabbi Bahar earlier. Really grateful to everyone putting different comments here in the chat, and want to make sure that we have a chance to think about what fasting means. And I do want to just share one text with us, which is a poem or a meditation that is written by Rabbi Simcha Weintraub. I'm going to share my screen for a second. And this is a passage that he wrote for when we can't fast on Yom Kippur. As a reminder, even though we have this obligation to fast, our health always comes first. And so if there's anyone who wants to fast, but you feel because of various health restrictions you can't fast, we want to make sure that you don't have this sense of guilt. As Jews, we have enough guilt already. But in all seriousness, we want to make sure that you're able to observe the day in a way that has meaning. So I thought I would just share this. Again, this is written for Yom Kippur. And as we heard from the text of Isaiah, the Yom Kippur fast is different in meaning for the Tisha B'Av fast. In fact, it's often called a white fast, whereas this one is called a black fast, in terms of the white fast being the purity and the newness, and this being black in terms of how we're feeling the sadness. But nonetheless, I want to share this with you in case anybody wants to fast but feels that they are unable. Ribono Shel Olam, Master of the universe, Creator of all, source of all life, who knows what is deep in human hearts, who nurtures every living being. As you know, dear God, Yom Kippur, or this way we could change it for Tisha B'Av, is fast approaching, and because of my condition, I am not able to keep the traditional fast. I cannot abstain totally from eating. Again, this part is for Yom Kippur, on this Day of Atonement, the Sabbath of Sabbaths, though I would encourage you to add in here on this Tisha B'Av. This year and every year, it is so central to join the people of Israel in denying ourselves food and drink for one day, so that we focus on correcting our misdeeds. And again, here, I didn't want to change his text because he wrote it, but we could say in correcting the sin of baseless hatred, or we could add in here to change it to say in remembering the sadness of the past, on knowing our mortality, on reaching for a life of Torah, mitzvot, and loving kindness, on you. You know, dear God, that is not my intent to be apart from our people and our tradition. My current state of health makes it unsuitable for me to fast. So, dear God, I turn to you now in sincerity and openness. Help me in the coming year to do my best in guarding my health. Help us, your children, learn how to protect our bodies from harm. Help us support others in caring for the Tselem Elohim, their image of God. Teach us to help one another grow and thrive in body, mind, and spirit. Guide caring family and healthcare professionals in their partnering with you to bring healing, if not cure, support, and strength, if not an end to symptoms. And if there is an opportunity for me to help others who suffer by doing something they need or by being attentive company, grant me the ability to do this mitzvah and with love and devotion. Rafei Kol Basar, healer of all living creatures, I thank you for the breath that is in me, for the community of Israel that lives, for the possibilities of today and tomorrow. May my eating be as a fast. May it be dedicated to you, to teshuvah, as we would say on Yom Kippur, but here we could say to teshuvah, or we could even say to ahava, to love, which is the afuch, as Rabbi Berkowitz said, which would be the opposite there of the hate, of the sinat chinam, to love, to the renewal and restoration of my relationship to you, O God, to others, and to myself. And for that, for those of you who cannot fast but wish to, let us say amen. And I want to add just one more thing on this concept of fasting, as those of you consider it, and for, as we said before, some of you are being introduced to it. I find it very interesting that one of the pop, I don't want to say pop culture, but something that's in the world right now, in the health world, is this concept of intermittent fasting. And I don't know if any of you have heard of it or have seen people do it. It is this idea where people are fasting. I'm not advocating it in any way, but it's interesting that people would do that as something for their own health, whereas we do fasting, or we're encouraged to fast, whether it's these 2 full days and the minor fasts, or whether you just fast on Yom Kippur, or whether you're unable to fast, whatever it may be, we don't do that for our physical health, but rather for our spiritual health. So with that, let me turn it back over, and I wish us all a meaningful fast if you choose to fast, not just a somchal, not an easy fast, but if you choose to fast, may it be a meaningful fast. And if you choose not to fast, may you bear in your heart the reasons for this day, the reasons for the fast, and may you make decisions that make this a meaningful day for you, a meaningful time to remember as it sits within you in any way, shape, or form. Kini Hiratzon, may that be God's will, and let us say, Amen.
Amen. So as we chant from the last chapter of Lamentations of Eicha, I've chanted from the beginning of each chapter, but for the last chapter, you will see that we have a very familiar line. When I will share my screen, and you will see that we have verses 19 through 22, and you will see a line as well as the music of Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Amenu kekedem. As Rabbi Berkowitz also looked at before, take us back, O God, to yourself, and let us come back, renew our days as of old. And so traditionally, like we do when you're reading Torah, and that we would repeat a section of Torah, we will repeat Hashivenu. We will repeat the line. We will repeat line 21, but instead of singing and chanting it, I would like for us to go back and sing the version of Hashivenu that perhaps might be familiar to some of you that we sing during the High Holy Days. And really, for me, when I do a Tisha B'Av observance and we sing this melody, it's kind of like the pre-official start to the High Holy Days. And although I would not like to, I do not want to bring that, to the attention of my rabbinical colleagues here, because it is indeed a stressful time. It's just a little tidbit of what is to come. And so I will now continue with the chanting of Eicha from chapter 5, verses 19 through 22. Ata Adonai l'olam tishev kisacha l'dor vador lama l'netzach tishkachenu tasvenu leorach yamim ashivenu Adonai elecha v'nashuva Chadesh Yameinu kekedem ki imano me'astanu katsavta aleinu me'od. And if everyone from their homes or their offices or their synagogues will join together singing Hashivenu to the music that is on our slide. Hashivenu, Hashivenu, Adonai Elecha, v'nashuva, Chadesh Yameinu kekedem.
It took me a second to find my own feed, and a tremendous thank you to my colleagues who come forward to offer their ruach and koach, their spirit and strength. So much wisdom for us on this night of Tisha B'Av as we go into this time of reflection, of loss, of remembering the temple, destruction of the temples, the golden calf, the failure of the spies, the expulsion from England, the expulsion from Spain, the start of World War. There are so many different moments of loss that are captured on this day of Tisha B'Av. It's a powerful time to stop and feel the mourning, to feel that sense of loss. There is, and Rabbi Siroty offered it beautifully, showing us how the last verses of Lamentations, there's that interesting flip that we start with verse 21 with the Hashivenu Adonai Elecha, but then we go to verse 22, truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us, and then we go back to Hashivenu. And I wanted to close our evening before Rabbi Mills is going to come back and truly close out our evening together. But the last piece of teaching I wanted was that idea of that repetition of the last verse. It's a beautiful value in Jewish life that we get that's called the nechemta. That you never end on the sad note. That whether you are reading Torah, whether you are teaching a lesson, that you never end in loss and bitterness, you never end with destruction or with curses, that you always find a way to say, wait a second, there's a sacred remnant. There's a little piece that will still keep going. Always leave people with a sense of hope. It's a beautiful, beautiful, incredible teaching. We say it to our students all the time. We say it to our congregations. And this is that amazing example of that nechemta. And I'm going to do a quick share of a screen so you can see these verses. This is from Lamentations, and you can see here, Hashivenu Adonai Elecha, take us back, O Lord, to yourself. Let us come back, renew our days of old. And then here is that last verse, Ki ma'os ma'astanu, for truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us. Think about what it would be the experience of Lamentations if we stopped there. If we stopped right there and that end with Tisha B'Av, God, you've deserted us, we feel rejected, we're sitting in bitterness. But our tradition says, don't stop there. Go back and reread Hashivenu. Take us back. Renew us as our days as in the past. And I want to point out something extraordinary to you. Because I think you might have seen in my chat message earlier, there's a real challenge in our culture in the way that we as Americans, we as Reformed Jews move through this world. Sometimes it's hard to get us to stop and feel our loss, to feel our sadness. Think about what Lamentations would be like if there wasn't a verse 22. The rabbis could have said, look, we don't like verse 22. It's sad. What we're going to do is we'll just stop with verse 21. But they don't do that. They do something interesting. They say, we're going to read all of it. We're going to read verse 22, but we're going to put a nechemta at the end. We'll repeat verse 21. Not wipe out the sad ending, but enclose it, encapsulate it, give it a parenthesis, add something back into the text so that we leave with hope. And it is so incredible to me that the rabbis use that strategy because it is part of why we do 9 Tisha B'Av. We've been talking about whether we should fast. Is it we really celebrate as Reformed Jews? I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and Tampa, Florida, the child of a very classical Reformed rabbi of very classical Reformed communities, and I didn't hear a whole lot about Tisha B'Av. And there is something powerful about stopping and sitting on the low stools, about doing these practices of mourning, of lighting candles for memory, of tearing pieces of fabric, of feeling that brokenness. And at the end of it, as Rabbi Goldwasser mentioned, making sure you come back Rabbi Berkowitz said, of turning lahafoch, to turn it back into hope. I say that because I think there's two pieces of it. There's Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, pray as if everything depends on God, and act as if everything depends on you. And the reality is, part of me wonders if the rabbis did this as, first of all, as a reminder to us that we need to stop and feel the pain, and then we can get to the nechemta, but also a challenge to God, a prayer to God, a push to God, saying, wait a second, God, these are the words we say. We finish with those words, for truly you have rejected us bitterly, you have raged against us. But then we say, but wait, God, don't forget, don't stop there. Our prayer is, yes, we have faced destruction. Some of it we brought on ourselves, some of it came from outside of us, powers that we can control. But don't forget, God, Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva chadesh hamenu k'kedem. Even when we are low, even when we are sad, take us back, O Eternal One, renew our days as in the past. That it's both a reminder to ourselves that we have to stop and feel the pain, but then finish with a nechemta, and it's also a call out to the universe. Don't have us end on a sour note. Always let us have that opportunity for redemption, that opportunity for hope, to get back on track, to find that seed, to plant it, and start that next generation. So I hope, as we close this observance of Tisha B'Av, I hope this is not the end of your Tisha B'Av. I want to add one last piece of this, is that, again, we have that tendency in American culture that we get through the painful part fast and we get back into life. There is no time stamp on this nechemta. There is nothing that says as soon as you say verse 21 or 22, go back and say verse 21. There is no time stamp because there is that opportunity and that responsibility to sit in that. You have rejected us, bitterly raged against us, to sit in the brokenness of Jerusalem, to sit with the refugees from Spain, to sit with our ancestors as they realize that we're going to have to wander for 40 years in the wilderness before their children and grandchildren got to the promised land. It's okay to sit in that pain, to imagine it, to feel it, to consider it, whether you fast or not. But then, let us all, as we call out to the universe and as we search within ourselves, find those opportunities for nechemta, to chadesha menu kedem, to think about the best of our days, those times where we made it out of Egypt, those times where we crossed the Jordan River, those times where we sat down, that brother and sister, that fellow, that all humans, we gathered with people we love, with people we are meeting for the first time, that we sat together in peace. Let us both appreciate the pain of Tisha B'Av, but also let us pray, and let us search, let us create that nechemta, that comfort, that hope, that faith and redemption at the end. Amen. And I turn it over to Rabbi Mills.
I'd just like to share a prayer as we end. As we widen our source to our grief to include the destruction that continues to take place today, we declare, let us search and examine our ways and turn back to the eternal. Let us lift up our hearts with our hands to God in heaven. And as we open our hearts to others and remind ourselves that we must not only bemoan their suffering, but also act to prevent it, we command ourselves, arise, cry out in the night at the beginning of the watches, pour out your heart like water in the presence of the eternal. And as we mourn for the loss of all that is sacred, may our grief compel us to respond to the suffering of others. May we arise and reach our hands outward, and may we cry out not only in mourning, but also in an ongoing effort to alleviate pain and destruction across the world. Amen.
Amen. And so once again, thank you so much to all of my incredible colleagues. Thank you for all of you from far and wide for joining us to observe this beginning of Tisha B'Av. And keep your eyes out and share suggestions with your rabbis, with your community, about other ways that we can collaborate like this. It really is incredible. There were, I believe, 8 of us, if I counted all of that, 8 of our colleagues. A lot of us are in small congregations, small communities, that we don't get to interact with colleagues that often. To be able to come together, at our height, we had 38 log-ons. There were over 40 of us gathered in any one of our congregations. We might have seen 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people gathered for Tisha B'Av. To be able to bring this kind of critical mass together is incredible. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to my colleagues, and I look forward for other opportunities to gather in this way, both for this night of mourning, but also very much for times of celebration. And I wish everyone well, and a big thank you, and I'll give my colleagues also a chance to, if they would like to sign off or to wave. And everyone take care. Feel the weight of this evening, and its own call. Whatever way we mark it, may it go smoothly for all of us. Take care.